Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with the Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And if you're watching us on YouTube, thank you very much for doing that. Please subscribe, leave us a like, leave us a rating. We appreciate that. But if you want to listen to us, we're also available wherever fine podcasts are found. And if you're listening to us on one of those podcast platforms, check us out on YouTube, see what we're up to there, and tell your friends, tell your family members all about the Lunch Hour and the other fine podcasts from the Federal Newswire. Joining me today, very excited to bring this guest on. His name is Marlo Oaks. He is the Utah State Treasurer. He's got a notable background in investment management and banking. His career includes managing multi-billion-dollar portfolios in locations like Hong Kong, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake City. His expertise was particularly evident during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where his investment strategies outperformed his peers. He also co-founded two nonprofit organizations. He was appointed as treasurer in 2021. He focuses on promoting economic freedom and strengthening Utah's fiscal position. He and his wife, Elaine, are lifelong Utah residents, and they have 6 children. Marlo Oaks, welcome to the show. So glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So listen, it's interesting to me. Early on in my career, I worked with a blind environmental attorney. And he was a former assistant attorney general in charge of the Environment and Natural Resources Division. And we started working on a case having to do with public lands issues. And I honestly, it was not something I was terribly familiar with, but he had me start investigating state enabling acts. And because we would look at the map and we would see that the federal government owned vast swatches of land west of the Rocky Mountains because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and various machinations after that. And the case we were working on had to do with a local government in Nevada that was dealing with this. Talk about the challenges Utah faces by having such vast swatches of federal land within its borders.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at the federal government's ownership of land, they own about 4% east of the Rockies, west of the Rockies, over half. Yeah. And Utah, it's 67% of the land.
Wow.
And so it's really a lot of our rural areas are federal lands. There's a lot of federal lands throughout the state, and a lot of activity happens on those lands, but we don't have much of a tax base on that land because it's owned by the federal government. Where taxes begin to come in is when economic activity happens. So right now, with the Biden administration reducing leases for oil extraction, one of the boards that I sit on, the Permanent Community Impact Board, it derives its revenue from severance taxes from the minerals that are extracted. So a lot of oil extraction mineral taxes really fund projects in rural Utah. That revenue is down 43% year over year, just from the moratorium on oil leases. So there's a serious impact in states like Utah, and you have Bureau of Land Management that has this concept of multiple use. That dates back to 1976 when Congress delegated their oversight of these lands to the Bureau of Land Management. Yeah. And it basically means that federal lands are to be used in multiple ways for the benefit of the community, in communities in which they are. And so you could have recreational access and mineral extraction and forestry, things of that nature. This is all a big part of the reality of living in a state like Utah, a state in the West.
And you and I both know that, obviously recreation only takes us so far. And the reality is that despite the fact that they talk about this issue as a multiple use area, it's always the resource extraction part of it that gets the short end of the stick, whether it's timbering, cutting trees on public lands, which has to do with the forest ecosystem, but also, and not just oil, but extraction elsewhere. Right? I mean, I would surprise me if Utah did not have vast other kinds of mineral resources, especially those critical rare earth minerals that we need if we're going to transition, right? If the Biden administration is so hell-bent on transitioning us into a green economy, Utah's mineral wealth should play a role in this, and yet it becomes next to impossible to get the permitting to get those minerals. Talk a little bit about that and how that impacts the state's fiscal picture.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Utah, I don't remember the exact number. It's something like 16 or 18 of 21 critical minerals. Utah has those, but it's almost impossible to access them because of what you just mentioned. So, these are the natural resources of America are one of the treasures and one of the key national security items that we should enjoy as a nation, and yet we are locking them away and not accessing them for artificial reasons.
So, and then let's also talk about, now you were appointed by the governor. This situation in which you are sort of figuring out the best way to sort of ask this question. You are intimately involved with the overall management of the state of Utah. You work with the governor, you work with the governor's team, you work with his other cabinet secretaries who are involved in this.
Yeah, actually, I don't. I was appointed because my predecessor left office shortly after the election.
Okay.
And so then I was on the ballot last year, and I'll be on the ballot next year. So I am an independent officer.
But my point is this. Got it. I understand. But my point is, you see your colleagues engaged in attempting to manage the state and having to deal with, negotiating with the federal bureaucracy, 2,000 miles away. Talk a little bit about the frustrations that you and your colleagues deal with in terms of having to create policy where you are being second guessed and having to essentially run by and get permission a federal government that is in some measure in Utah, but also really, in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles away.
Yeah, no, it is a serious issue because, locals tend to understand the land better. They know what is required to manage that land effectively. And when you have to answer to a distant bureaucratic engine or machine, it becomes very difficult to make good choices that benefit both the environment and the local communities. There's really a balance there, and it's very difficult to manage that at a distance to really benefit all parties involved.
So let's talk a little bit about, I want to come back to the tax issue. Because again, the federal government comes back and they say that there are these things called PILT payments in lieu of taxes, and talk about how those are grossly undercalculated and they never achieve what you need them to achieve and deliver the sort of the maximum value that otherwise other uses might deliver.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the property tax that could be derived from private land, it's vastly larger than these payment in lieu of taxes, right? That are supposed to compensate rural communities, and it really a tremendous loss of revenue. And so that's where some of these severance taxes come in and try to make up some of the difference, but it's really difficult to have much control over your tax base when it's managed from Washington, D.C. by bureaucracies that often are out of touch with, the needs of a community. And the PILTs, they sound nice, but really don't generate nearly as much tax revenue as what would be generated from a private land-held state.
Sure. So and it's not just the public lands that the federal government creates problems for. And this sort of is starting to be an entree into the 30 by 30 issue. But, things like the Endangered Species Act, things like Clean Water Act and the wetlands provisions, excuse me, those affect private land and inhibit the utilization of private lands. Talk about how that's an impact. And let's start talking a little bit about the 30 by 30 problem that you guys have.
Yeah, I mean, there's this effort really, and it's all in really couched in the climate catastrophe, or the climate crisis narrative. This is really what animates the oversight of these lands today. In the past, Bureau of Land Management, the multiple use doctrine is really being twisted now to provide conservation leases above multiple use, and really illustrates the problem that we face, where we don't control the land, and now suddenly the land use is going to be changed drastically. So you're cutting off the economic activity because it's considered unsustainable. It's not in the conservation area sufficiently protected, and so this is a major shift in how lands are managed, certainly in the West, these federal lands, and it creates serious problems for these rural communities. There's a lot of ranching in Utah.
Oh, yeah.
Ranching, has grazing on federal land. That's a key component here. If you can't graze on federal land, that's a major that has major impact to the ranching industry.
Yeah, you come down. So let's tick off the list here. You can't graze, you can't cut timber, you can't drill for oil, you can't get rare earth minerals extracted. All that they really do leave you with is the recreation economy that works on a larger scale, right? Utah has fantastic skiing, for instance, and they have fantastic hiking, and those things. But if you were someone who was working in the timbering industry, it's very tough. Or you are a former cattle rancher and you can no longer graze. It comes down to the very callous attitude that several Democrats have said, which is learn how to code. But listen, as vibrant as Utah's tech sector, and it is a vibrant sector, getting a former cattle rancher, someone who'd been ranching cattle for, let's say, 20 years, let's not say a whole career, but let's say 20 years they'd spent grazing cattle. They're not going to transition into the tech economy very easily, are they? And there just aren't enough recreation jobs to go around, the kinds that would help them make ends meet, right?
Exactly. And I mean, think about where the agricultural production is, certainly in the West. I mean, that's all rural communities, and agriculture is under threat because they certainly in the natural asset companies, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But
I want to talk about this.
We're looking at changing from industrial agriculture to regenerative agriculture. So you're looking at changing what agriculture looks like on that land, and the other economic activities like grazing and mineral extraction and things of that nature. Because of carbon emissions, because of the impact on the climate, we're now saying we can't do those activities. And so you're literally shutting down critical elements of the economy.
Right.
Where do people get fed? It comes from rural America. Right. And a lot of this natural resource extraction is in rural America. And if we're talking about shutting that down, we become more dependent on other nations and significantly harm our national security and our economic security.
Let's shift gears a little bit, because you raised the issue of natural asset companies, and this is why I was really buoyed to have you on the show, because you have a very unique background in this. We just talked to Elizabeth Nixon, who's an author about this issue. We've talked to a few other people. In fact, when I start to talk about the concept of natural asset companies, people think that I'm making it up, that it's some kind of weird conspiracy theory. But talk about it within the context of your background in investment management and banking. Explain what natural asset companies are, how they are applied in practice, and the concerns that you have as someone who came out of this sector.
Yeah, so it's really animated by what is perceived as a gap in funding for addressing climate change. 5 trillion every year. We need 5 trillion more to address the climate.
Amazing. Yes.
Yeah. And then, we need 400 or 500 billion to address biodiversity issues. Yeah. And so they say, well, the markets aren't working because they're not addressing these problems. And so the way to address it is to better track externalities, negative externalities and positive externalities.
Right.
And so we're going to put a price tag on those externalities. And we're going to try to drive really financial metrics into natural processes and add a price tag there and be able to track it.
This was first suggested by Enron back before they went belly up. We used to call this the Enron plan, but go ahead, please talk about this.
Yeah, so really the idea then is it's really looking at natural processes like the creation of clean air. How does that happen? Well, it happens through the absorption of carbon by plant life, and they create oxygen. How about clean water? It goes through into our aqueducts through the soil, and you've got to have good soil to do that process. And it's those kinds of natural processes that have never had a price tag associated with them because we've thought of them as sort of these God-given positive externalities that are required for life. And now when we put a price tag on it, that suddenly we are able to manage that. But that's a little bit scary because who gets to have access to the resource, right? Right. Who's determining who can breathe clean air?
Real quick, because in essence, one of the books that changed my life and my way of thinking was Hernando de Soto's Mystery of Capital. And in it, de Soto talks about how assigning property rights, it creates all kinds of really great conditions in both a political economy and in the monetary economy generally. These are good things, but then it comes down to how those property rights get assigned, who assigns them, and whether or not people have an equal ability, not equitability, but an ability to go out and get them. So talk about how the values get assigned, how this winds up working in practice.
Yeah, and this is where the New York Stock Exchange needed to go to the SEC and get a rule that would allow them to list these kinds of companies, because it's based on the United Nations accounting standards or system that they put together that basically values ecological services, the kinds of processes that happen in nature. What is pollination worth? What is the creation of clean air worth? And it's not based on economic activity. It's based on natural activity. Right. And so it's very arbitrary. How do you determine that? And so one way to create values that maybe people will find more believable is to drive carbon offsets and to say, okay, we need to invest in natural asset companies to offset our carbon footprint as a company. Therefore, we're going to put money in. And then it creates this illusion of actual value creation, even though it's based on natural processes that have artificial values associated with them. It's really kind of odd.
Well, there are a couple of different examples that I can give. It's like the line from Gangs of New York. It's not who casts the votes, who counts the votes that matter. And more to the point, if you are the one creating the metrics, that's how you can game the system. And that's incredibly disconcerting, especially when you then couple it with the very large hedge funds getting access to this, and frankly, the American people not knowing that this is going on, right? As I said, I talk about this, people's eyes glaze over. They think that I have to be making this up, but this is really what is happening. So keep going, sir. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No. You're exactly right. And not only wealthy investors, but we're talking about some of the largest pools of capital in the world that would have access to these. So China's sovereign wealth fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, Russian sovereign wealth fund. I mean, these massive pools of capital. And what better way to harm the United States than lock up resources without a fight?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it really is a very effective tool.
Let me put a fine point on this. So you have let's say a Chinese sovereign wealth fund, and they buy, and what we're talking about here are air rights in federally owned lands. So again, federally owned timberland. So again, they're valuing the clean air production of these lands over the extractive nature, setting aside the issue of that younger trees process CO2 into O2 much more efficiently, much more quickly. But set all of that aside for a moment. China then turns around and they can dictate the terms to how they go about selling carbon offsets to people, right? So the idea is you are someone, you have a carbon footprint, you have a certain allowance. At some point, somebody sets a standard where you have an allowance of X allotment of your carbon footprint. If you want more, right? If you're a wealthy person, if you're Justin Bieber, pulling that name out of thin air, if you're Justin Bieber, you can buy more carbon offsets so you can live a more lavish lifestyle. You can have the gas stove in your home. You can have an SUV that burns diesel gas or whatever. All of these things that the average American won't be able to do because they will not be able to afford greater carbon offsets. I mean, this is it seems to me, again, it's fraught with peril from an economic standpoint. The left has said for many years that they want to reduce the space between the haves and have-nots. This seems to exacerbate that. I mean, and nobody seems to know that it's going on. I don't understand how this can be possible. And I'm someone who spends my days in the regulatory world. This astonishes me. Your thoughts here?
Well, and you think about the comment period that the SEC provided on this rule. It was 21 days. Why?
Yes.
That's a point in what you're talking about here is that they didn't even provide a reasonable comment period to allow people to know what was going on.
Right.
So clearly they don't want people to know what's going on. And, coming into the end of the year, Christmas time, and they're saying January 2nd is we're going to decide whether we allow this rule or not. I mean, people are distracted. And so, of course, this is all well designed to keep this out of headlines. And that's why I'm grateful for opportunities like this to talk about it.
I mean, it is a situation. In fact, something, because I've been on the air in DC this week. I may have to bring this up on the air. I haven't had a chance to as of yet. I mean, talk about this. Having been, and this is you I'm talking about, having been in this financial services sector, investment management and banking. How do you see this playing out? I mean, again, talk about the dangers. Talk about the difference between the investment opportunities that the average everyday American has, the average everyday Utahn has, versus the people that these funds are catering to. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is that these natural asset companies listing on the New York Stock Exchange, they're talking about it as an additional asset class, because they want to appeal to as large of an audience as possible. Why? Because they want as much money as possible to move into this asset class, and that will allow them to lock up more resources. This is all about locking up the resources of the United States. And in fact, they talk about how they envision making endless profits from these natural processes, but it's also about stopping mineral extraction and this economic activity that is deemed to be bad for the environment. Now, what happens when natural asset companies end up with the best resources in the United States, right, sitting in their companies? I've forgotten the exact reason why they could stop or delist from the stock exchange, but there is a mechanism to allow them to delist. but it doesn't require them to divest of all the assets. And so you could see a situation where they delist and then they start extracting all the assets, extracting all the resources, and they've effectively taken over the resources of the country. And so, you could look at it in that way and saying this is really just a play to lock up the resources in the name of climate change.
Did your office or did someone else in the Utah state government file comments on this SEC rulemaking?
Yeah, so the Department of Natural Resources filed a comment during the last day. Actually, I mean, very few comments were submitted. And
listen, I was angry because this is my bread and butter is dealing with the regulatory world, and I was angry when I found out about this about 2 weeks after the comment period closed. In fact, it was one of those situations where I said, this is the kind of thing that would have maybe even found that within a week after it closed. And I said, this is the kind of thing that I would have liked to have known a week ago because I would have put in comments. So you guys filed comments. Depending on what happens, are you guys considering a challenge to whatever the final rule is?
I think we have to, and it's it's really not my call, but sure. I would be very surprised if we didn't.
I'm going to tell you, the good folks at places like the Institute for Justice and the Pacific Legal Foundation, this is the kind of case, given their track records before the Supreme Court, this is the kind of thing that would be to me, or the Competitive Enterprise Institute, this would be a slam dunk to sort of work with those entities to get something done here, because I don't spend a lot of time talking about the regulatory process. I've taught it. I deal with it in my other job. But the only way you can challenge a final rule, is if you file comments beforehand. Let me ask you this before I let you go. Were these the kinds of things that shocked you? Because you didn't come out of government. In reading your bio, I know you weren't into the political thing beforehand. I mean, was it these kinds of proceedings? Did they shock you when you found out about them?
Oh yeah. So, I had spent most of my career in the investment management world and was not aware of how deeply embedded ESG had become in the investment world. And this is really kind of in the same vein. Yeah. This effort to, coerce basically land ownership and take over land. It's very similar. There's a lot of parallels to ESG. And so, yeah, I mean, it is very surprising. And these are things that have never happened before. I don't think. I mean, it's incredible. So, it's very surprising.
Something like this is not happened before. I mean, as I said, there have been other attempts, right? The issue of trying to quantify the carbon impact as a way of essentially making people pay more for energy and pay more for their lifestyles. I mean, we're talking, that's again almost 30 years old and 25 years old now, because I remember working on this stuff way back when. Before I let you go, so one of the things that I like to do, and I say this on every podcast, I had contemplated starting a podcast called Outside Interest, but I already have 3 podcasts. I don't need to add a 4th. But the idea is to ask folks who are involved in politics and policy the things that they do outside of this. Now, I know you have 6 kids. You may not have a lot of free time, but on the other hand, you may be working with them. What are some of your outside interests when you're not working on things as treasurer of the state of Utah? What can folks find you doing?
Yeah, so this last summer I went fishing and a couple different times with some of my kids, and we like to play board games. And
what are their age ranges?
15 to 27. Okay, so they're getting up there. Yeah, they're getting up there.
That's great. So you're running for re-election again. Not that we get political here, not that we endorse, but that election is next year?
Correct.
Excellent. Well, there you go. Well, we wish you the best of luck. Marlo Oaks, he is the Utah State Treasurer. Thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
And this has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. As I said at the beginning, if you're listening to us on one of those fine podcast platforms, take a look at our channel on YouTube. It's the Federal Newswire's channel on YouTube. We've got several other podcasts that are out there. If you are watching us on YouTube, you can go ahead and listen to us wherever fine podcasts are found. I am Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.